have already introduced. And her question is, how do we relearn what we know about race?
Thank you so much, Dr. Schufert. I'm so excited to be a part of this panel and conversation. So the first thing, we don't have the chat enabled, but the first question I want people to think about, just think about this in your mind. When was the first time that you knew what race you were? And when I'm talking about race, I'm talking about what you check on the census. When was the first time you knew what race you were? And then I want you to think a little bit further about, was that experience positive or a negative one? So that experience, your lived experience, that sets the foundation for what you know about race, whether it's true or not. It becomes your truth, and you become cemented in that. So for us to think about how to unlearn certain patterns and behaviors and systems, we really have to do some level setting. So I'm going to bring a little history and context to the conversation. So for a long time, we've talked about race. So it goes back really to about the 1500s. So I'm going to also reference, because I'm with a higher educational institution, I think that learning materials are important. And so the book that I reference here is called The History of White People by Irvin Painter, Black woman. So I want to make sure that we also put some Black reading into your library. And she talks really about the history of white people. And we talked about race relative to how we delineate people, but it wasn't quite yet scientific. We knew that there was differentiation, particularly between African and Europeans, and she goes into that. But I'll point you to specifically a biological scientist. His name was Carl Linnaeus. He's known as the father of taxonomy, and he was known for creating these systems of naming and classifying organisms like plants and bacteria and animals. And then he decided one day that he was going to begin to classify humans by race. This is about the 1700s. So I want you to understand where we are contextually, which was the beginning of us really seeing what was happening in the science community, and began to be for hundreds and thousands of years, really the way that anthropology was developed. And so I referenced this other book, another Black woman author, Dr. Joy DeGruy, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. She's a psychologist. And in here, she talks about this gentleman. And here's how he described races. So he broke it down into 4 races. I'm going to use the modern terms. He was using his own scientific terms in there. But he started with Indian American, red Americans. They are reddish, choleric, which is bad-tempered, obstinate, stubborn, regulated by custom. Then we get to Europeans. They're white, fickle, sanguine, positive, blue-eyed, gentle, and governed by laws. Then we're at Asians. They're sallow, which is yellow or pale brown complexion, grave, dignified, avaricious, which is extreme greed, and ruled by opinion. And then we get to Africans, Black, phlegmatic, which is unemotional, cunning, lazy, careless, and governed by caprice, so sudden change in behavior. Okay, so I want you to think about, does that sound like, if you're on this call, does that sound like who you are? What you start to see is the differentiation of whiteness. So everybody else is the lower level, and really Black, to be honest with you, is the lowest level. So white is to be the right thing. It's important for me to then provide context about what the idea of whiteness is. This behavior, the action that leads us to really believe that white is superior. And it's this spectrum that requires really every person to abandon the institution of who they are so they can be closer to it. So I'm going to give you this book, which is called Working Towards Whiteness. And it's really about how America's immigrants became white. And so the poet Diane DePrima talks about, she gives a quote, and it says, this pseudo-white, and I'm using the quotes that she has here, this pseudo-white identity was not something that just fell on us out of the blue, but something that many Italian Americans grabbed at with both hands. Many felt that their culture, language, food, songs, music, identity was a small price to pay for entering the American mainstream. Or they thought, as my parents probably did, that they could keep these good Italian things in private and become white in public. So what you see is the construct of whiteness, not based on biology or science or fact, as the earlier scientist was trying to tell us, but it is only functional, and its function really is about separation. and it's about superior separation, particularly, again, from Blacks. So after we have Carl Linnaeus, who grouped people based on their skin color, we then go to Johann, or maybe it's Johann Blumenbach, who began, again in the 1700s, began grouping categories based on physical features, so like your skull, your hair, and he also was the one who originated the term Caucasian. So again, trying to create more spaces. I want to give you this contextual piece as well. So Carl received his PhD after 1 week and 13 pages of dissertation. So if I have any PhDs on the line, you will understand that you went through far more than he did from what was considered a Dutch mail order institution. And Johann got his PhD within 1 year and 16 pages of a dissertation. I want you to understand how even in that, whiteness shows up as superior, the invention of whiteness. So as you see, the classification of race really is to encourage racism, which is not just about superior thinking and behavior, but really now we're going to institute laws and policies and power structures using science, which we know to be theoretical in opinion based on now what has been proven. So I want to give you some modern day linkages to the classification and the construct of race and how it's further ingrained into racism in the culture and in our country and really in the world. If you have traveled globally, you also know that there are issues around racism all across the world. So I'll start with something that we're very familiar with, which is modern day policing. So we've seen hundreds of killings. George Floyd was not the first person that we saw murdered on television or on our social media feeds by police officers. Those brutal attacks have been happening over and over and over again. We saw it with Rodney King, with not necessarily death, but that was our first kind of socialized experience relative to kind of the new generation. So we've seen lynching posters. So if you keep going back to slavery, you think about those overseers and those bounty hunters, that linkage there goes from race to racism, because the idea is to correlate how poorly I am to treat you. That's the correlation here. And so we're not just talking about a couple of bad actors. We're talking about over time, a system that has said, we will actually not prosecute your bad behavior. As a matter of fact, there are laws that were written on books that said you have the absolute right to kill a slave. That's your property. You can do with that what you want to do with that. And so we have to understand the construct that was developed to create the delineation here. I want you to just hopefully you're just getting what I'm talking about. So I'll go further to talk about the healthcare system. So Dr. James Marion Sims is the father of gynecology. I want to show you the materials that he would use, and you may not be able to see them because we're on this Zoom, but if we're in person now, I can try to bring them. But do you see that? Do you see what that is? That is what went inside of Black slave girls and women to reorchestrate their insides without any anesthetic so that he could experiment and reconfigure and torture and torment. Why? Because there's this myth that though we are lazy, based on what was indicated there, we also are the stronger version as well. So we can adhere and take anything. So what happens now is we're looking at Black women in maternity wards who are not leaving because when they speak up and they speak out, the doctors say, oh no, you're okay. I was reading recently on Facebook where a woman said that she went in and she was complaining about something, and whatever she was sharing, the doctor smirked and kind of laughed at her as if her complaint or issue was minuscule. So I want you to understand this again is about how race is correlated to how poorly I will treat you based on where you live in the classification. And that's how we get to racism. And then this last linkage, which I think is appropriate for this conversation, is about education. If you look at alarming literacy rates across the country, it's absolutely inconceivable, particularly as a parent, that in every corner of our country, in every city, in every space, that if you look at the disaggregated number, our Black children are performing so poorly. But it's actually not that far of a stretch. When you think about it, it's probably only been about 150 some odd years when I start to look at the anti-literacy laws on the books. It has only been a very short amount of time that people actually did not get murdered for reading and writing. So then how, if you have a system that tells you you're not allowed to read and write, and when you do, we will kill you. We will chop your arm off. We will chop an ear off. We will take your tongue. I mean, those are real actions based on what race has been correlated to racism to do. So I want you to know why this matters. This matters, and these linkages matter because I want to bring you back to the first question I asked you, which was about when you first knew that who you were racially, and what that felt like and what those experiences were like, because that very foundation of what you know about race is based on the culture and the bias and environment that you grew up in. And so it might have shown up when you went to the grocery store and, you know, somebody bumped the cart bumped your car and you saw an experience. It might have been when your parent had to slam on the brakes and they saw who was driving and they said something. Or it might have been when you had that really close friend to you who lived right in your community, who went to school with you, who was your best friend, but somehow couldn't come to your home. Those things shaped and developed your identity, and particularly your identity with race and your relationship and your correlation with racism. But it's not always as overt as we saw in the earlier days. What it looks like now is the subtleties of how you incorporate that into the work environment. Many of you are making decisions that go beyond bias, which is everyone has them. It goes into how you use that bias to then put some type of power with it and create a discriminatory practice that is based on, honestly, just untruths that you're not familiar with because we haven't unlearned some of this behavior. So really to understand and to begin to dismantle and really just start all over again in a lot of instances, because you're talking about, in some cases, 500 years of oppression, we have to then be willing to look at the systems that we've been complicit in, those systems of white supremacy, those systems of white exceptionalism. You have to sit with yourself, and I want you to ask yourself this question: where have I been complicit? Sometimes out of survival, sometimes out of trauma. Everyone has trauma. There is no removal of trauma in this, or out of general life experience. And then what actions are you willing to unlearn so that you can change the power dynamic so that someone else gets a chance to have a place in your environment? I'll leave you with this, that the tragedy in all of this is that the country that we live in is not actually ready to address race and the socially designed system of racism, because it would then cause us to investigate and address the truths of our systems and organizations and individual behaviors and identity. It would make you question your parents and your grandparents. It would make you question who you are and where you come from. And we're not willing to really be uncomfortable, and we're not willing to be shamed, and we're not willing to have any level of empathy that really reverses or recovers us from 500 and some odd years of active oppression. So we have to recognize that though race is not real, racism is. And so that's what I will share about how we began to unlearn, is to really learn our history, go back and learn that. And then you can go through, I think what I heard Ms. Lassane talk about and what I heard Dr. Bates talk about, you can begin to really go into those things once you're willing to unlearn the history that you have in your background.